March 18, 1989, and the small West Virginia town of Wheeling was experiencing an early spring thaw, with temperatures reaching the mid-50s and snow melting from the previous week's storm that had blanketed the Ohio Valley. Wheeling Park was a sprawling public space with athletic fields, walking trails, and picnic areas that drew families on weekends, and on this Saturday afternoon dozens of people were enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. Lucas Grant was 14 years old that day, a freshman at Wheeling Central Catholic High School with dark blonde hair worn slightly long in the style of the time, blue eyes, and an athletic build from playing on the school's basketball team. He wore a denim jacket over a red hooded sweatshirt, faded jeans, white Reebok high tops, and he carried a Sony Walkman in his jacket pocket, with headphones around his neck listening to Def Leppard tapes. Lucas had come to Wheeling Park at 2 p.m. to meet friends for a pickup basketball game on the outdoor courts, a regular Saturday activity when weather permitted during the school year. His mother, Susan Grant, had dropped him off at the park entrance on National Road, and Lucas had promised to call from the payphone near the courts at 5 p.m. when he was ready to be picked up. "Be home by dinner at 6, Susan had reminded him, "and stay where there are other people. Don't go wandering off into the woods by yourself." Lucas had rolled his eyes at his mother's caution but agreed, and he'd walked into the park carrying a basketball under his arm, heading toward the courts about a quarter-mile from the entrance. The basketball courts were located in a central area of the park with good visibility, surrounded by open fields, and with the parking lot about 300 yards away through a paved walking path. Lucas arrived at the courts around 2:10 p.m. and found his friends already playing, and he joined a game that continued until approximately 4 p.m., when most of the group decided to leave. 3 of Lucas's friends left together at 4:05 p.m., and they later told investigators that Lucas said he was going to shoot baskets alone for another 30 minutes before calling his mom for pickup. He wanted to practice his free throws, his friend Michael Torres recalled. "We asked if he wanted to come get pizza with us, but he said his mom was making dinner so he'd stay and practice a bit longer." The friends waved goodbye to Lucas and walked toward the parking lot, and that was the last time anyone who knew him saw Lucas Grant alive, standing alone on the basketball court bouncing a ball at 4:05 p.m. At 5:15 p.m., when Lucas hadn't called, Susan became concerned and drove back to Wheeling Park, and she found the basketball courts empty with no sign of her son anywhere in the immediate area. Susan checked the payphone and surrounding areas, asking people if they'd seen a 14-year-old boy in a denim jacket, but nobody had seen Lucas in the past hour. By 5:45 p.m., Susan was panicking and had contacted park security, and within minutes several guards were searching the area calling Lucas's name and checking restrooms and pavilions. At 6:10 p.m., a park employee found Lucas's basketball abandoned near a trail entrance about 200 yards from the courts, and the ball was just sitting on the ground, as if someone had set it down and walked away. Wheeling police were called at 6:20 p.m., and officers immediately began coordinating a search of Wheeling Park's 400 acres, looking for a teenager who'd seemingly vanished while alone at basketball courts. In approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes between 4:05 p.m. when his friends left and 5:15 p.m. when his mother arrived, 14-year-old Lucas Grant disappeared from a public park on a busy Saturday afternoon. If you want to hear how DNA finally solved this heartbreaking case decades later, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's see what happened. The location where Lucas's basketball was found became the focus of initial investigation, and officers examined the trail entrance for signs of struggle or evidence of where Lucas had gone. The trail led into a wooded area of the park that was less developed, with paths winding through trees toward a creek about half a mile away, and it was a route some people used, though not heavily trafficked. Detective Robert Chen arrived at 7 p.m. and immediately organized search teams to cover the trails and wooded sections, concerned that Lucas might be injured somewhere and unable to call for help. By nightfall, over 100 volunteers were searching Wheeling Park with flashlights, calling Lucas's name into the darkness and checking every building, shelter, and area where a teenager might have gone. Susan was interviewed about Lucas's state of mind and whether he had any reason to run away, but she insisted he'd been happy and looking forward to a school dance the following weekend. Lucas wasn't troubled, Susan said through tears. He was a normal 14-year-old with good grades and friends. He had no reason to disappear. Something happened to him in that park. By Sunday morning, the search had expanded beyond Wheeling Park to surrounding neighborhoods and businesses, with bloodhounds brought from Charleston to track Lucas's scent from where his basketball had been found. The dogs picked up a trail leading from the basketball courts toward the wooded area where the ball had been discovered, and they tracked along the trail for approximately a quarter mile before losing the scent near the creek. The fact that the scent ended at the creek troubled investigators because it suggested Lucas had either entered the water or been transported away from that point, perhaps in a vehicle that had accessed the area via a service road. Detective Chen discovered that a maintenance road used by park workers ran parallel to the creek and was accessible from a gate on the park's eastern boundary, creating a potential route for someone to have brought a vehicle into the wooded area. Tire tracks were found on the maintenance road, but they couldn't be dated or attributed to specific vehicles because park maintenance trucks used the road regularly, and the recent snowmelt had made the ground muddy. Lucas's friends were interviewed extensively about his behavior and whether he'd mentioned meeting anyone or had seemed worried about anything, but all described a normal Saturday of basketball with no unusual circumstances. He was in a good mood, Michael Torres explained. We were all joking around and talking about the dance next weekend. Lucas was planning to ask a girl named Jennifer to go with him. He had no problems. The girl Lucas had been planning to ask to the dance, Jennifer Walsh, was interviewed and confirmed she'd spoken with Lucas at school on Friday, and he'd seemed excited about the weekend with no indication anything was wrong. Susan and her husband David provided information about Lucas's life, and investigators found no evidence of problems at home, no conflicts with family members, no reason he'd want to run away or disappear. Lucas's bedroom was searched for any clues about his state of mind or plans, but police found only typical teenage belongings: sports posters, school books, cassette tapes, and a calendar with the upcoming dance circled in red marker. By Monday, the case had become regional news with Lucas's photo appearing on television across West Virginia and Ohio, and tips began coming in from people claiming to have seen him at various locations. One witness reported seeing a teenager matching Lucas's description, talking to a man in a dark sedan near the park entrance around 4:30 p.m. Saturday, but the description was vague and couldn't be verified. FBI was contacted given the potential for abduction, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Pittsburgh field office to coordinate federal resources and bring experience from similar cases. Agent Wells interviewed park employees and regular visitors about whether they'd seen anyone suspicious on March 18th, or if anyone had been paying unusual attention to teenagers using the basketball courts. One park worker mentioned that he'd noticed a man sitting in a car near the courts earlier that day, and the man had seemed to be watching rather than participating in any activity, but the worker hadn't thought much of it at the time. This lead was investigated extensively, with police trying to identify the vehicle and its occupant, but the park worker couldn't provide specific details about the car's make or the man's appearance beyond middle-aged, maybe in his 40s. Detective Chen theorized that Lucas had been approached by someone while shooting baskets alone, perhaps someone claiming to need help or offering Lucas something, and had been lured away from the courts toward the wooded area. The abandoned basketball suggested Lucas had set it down to follow someone or investigate something, planning to return, but had never made it back to retrieve it before whatever happened occurred. By late March, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after 2 weeks produced no trace of Lucas, despite thousands of volunteer hours and extensive professional search teams covering Wheeling Park and surrounding areas. The creek where the bloodhounds had lost Lucas's scent was dragged and searched by divers, but no evidence was found in the water or along the bank suggesting Lucas had drowned or been in the creek. Susan and David appeared on local television pleading for information about Lucas, with Susan holding his school photo and begging anyone who'd been at Wheeling Park on March 18th to come forward with any information. "Someone saw something," Susan said through tears. "There were dozens of people at that park. Someone must have seen Lucas after 4 o'clock. Please, if you know anything, call the police. We just want our son back." The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in April 1989, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips from across the country. But investigation revealed each lead was either mistaken identity or someone trying to help with inaccurate information. By summer, the case had gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Lucas Grant became another teenager who'd vanished from a public place in broad daylight, despite multiple people being nearby. The years passed with unbearable slowness for the Grant family, with 1989 becoming 2000 and then 2010, and Lucas's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it the morning he'd gone to play basketball at Wheeling Park. Age progression photos were created showing what Lucas might look like at 25, then 35, then 45, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases, though the family feared he'd died in 1989. Susan never forgave herself for dropping Lucas off at the park that day, and she carried guilt that somehow her decision to let him go alone had led to his disappearance, though logically she knew he'd been to the park hundreds of times safely. David struggled with anger at the investigation, believing police hadn't done enough in the critical first hours, and he spent years conducting his own searches of Wheeling Park and surrounding areas looking for any clue about what had happened to Lucas. Their marriage survived, though it was forever scarred by the tragedy, both understanding that they were bound together by the shared experience of losing their son, and that separating would mean losing the only other person who truly understood. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2005 when he joined West Virginia State Police, and he periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping that advancing technology might reveal something investigators in 1989 had missed. Morrison tracked down and re-interviewed people who'd been at Wheeling Park on March 18, 1989, now adults in their 30s and 40s, asking if time had changed their memories or made them recall details they'd withheld. But most had only vague recollections of that Saturday afternoon, the basketball games and the warm weather, and then learning later that a boy had disappeared, and nobody could provide new information beyond what they'd told police decades earlier. By 2015, Lucas would have been 40 years old, possibly with a career and family if he'd somehow survived, and Susan held memorial services each March 18th at a church in Wheeling, though she'd never had a body to bury. True crime podcasts discovered Lucas's case in the late 2010s, and several shows featured detailed episodes analyzing the hour between when his friends left and when his mother arrived, proposing theories about what had happened. Some podcasters suggested Lucas had been targeted by someone who'd been watching the basketball courts, someone who'd waited for him to be alone before approaching with some ruse to lure him away. Others believed it was a crime of opportunity by someone who happened to be in the park, someone who'd seen a teenage boy alone and had acted impulsively without planning. In November 2023, construction workers excavating for a new housing development on the outskirts of Wheeling, about 5 miles from Wheeling Park, uncovered human remains while digging the foundation for the first house. The remains were partially buried in what had been a wooded area before development, and they appeared to have been there for decades based on deterioration and the vegetation growth around them. West Virginia State Police were called immediately, and Detective Sarah Chen from the Cold Case Unit arrived to investigate what was clearly a homicide that had been concealed for many years. The remains were carefully extracted and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory, and preliminary examination suggested they belonged to a teenage male who'd been buried for approximately 30 to 35 years. Chen immediately thought of Lucas Grant's case given the age of the remains, the proximity to Wheeling, and the time frame that matched, though 5 miles seemed far from the park for someone without a vehicle. The excavation site was in an area that had been largely undeveloped in the 1980s, accessed by rural roads that few people traveled, making it a plausible location for someone to bury a body without being observed. Chen requested that DNA be extracted from the remains and compared against the Grant family's genetic profile, which had been established years earlier using samples from Susan and David. The forensic analysis took 8 weeks because the remains were significantly degraded, but scientists were able to recover sufficient genetic material for comparison and identification. Susan and David, now in their 70s, received a call from Detective Chen in January 2024, asking them to come to the police station for an important update on Lucas's case. "We've found remains that we believe are Lucas," Chen explained gently. "DNA testing has confirmed identity, and I wanted you to tell you personally before any public announcement is made." The confirmation that Lucas had been found brought devastating grief mixed with relief after 34 years of not knowing, and Susan collapsed sobbing in David's arms, finally having the answer she'd dreaded but needed. When DNA results were formally presented, they showed a 99.96% probability that the remains were Lucas Grant, missing since March 1989 from Wheeling Park when he'd been 14 years old. Chen's investigation revealed that the property where Lucas's remains were found had been owned in 1989 by a man named Thomas Brennan, who'd lived alone in a small house on the land before selling it in 1995 and moving out of state. Thomas Brennan had died in 2019 at age 73 in Arizona, but Detective Chen obtained warrants to exhume his body for DNA comparison against evidence collected from the burial site and from Lucas's remains. The exhumation and DNA analysis took 10 weeks, and when results came back in March 2024, exactly 35 years after Lucas's disappearance, they contained shocking findings that transformed understanding of the case. DNA found on deteriorated fabric fragments recovered with Lucas's remains matched Thomas Brennan's genetic profile with 99.8% certainty, providing conclusive evidence that he'd been in contact with the victim. Forensic examination of the remains revealed that Lucas had died from strangulation, and investigators theorized that Brennan had killed him shortly after the abduction, possibly within hours of taking him from Wheeling Park. Detective Chen investigated Brennan's background extensively and discovered a disturbing history that had never been connected to Lucas's disappearance, despite him living just 5 miles from where the boy had vanished. Brennan had been questioned briefly in 1989 as part of the general canvass of people who lived near Wheeling Park, but he'd been dismissed as a suspect because he claimed to have been home alone that entire Saturday. With no witnesses to contradict his alibi and no evidence connecting him to Lucas at the time, investigators had moved on to other leads, never realizing they'd interviewed the person responsible. Chen discovered that Brennan had been investigated in 1985 for following teenage boys at a shopping mall in Pittsburgh, but no charges had been filed, and the incident had never been flagged when West Virginia police ran his background in 1989. Former neighbors of Brennan were tracked down and interviewed about his behavior in the late 1980s, and several recalled that he'd seemed nervous and paranoid in the weeks following Lucas's disappearance. He stopped going out during the day, one neighbor remembered, and I saw him burning things in a barrel behind his house one night in late March 1989, which seemed odd, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. This timeline aligned with when Brennan would have needed to dispose of evidence from Lucas's abduction and murder, and the burning likely destroyed clothing or other items that could have connected him to the crime. Chen theorized that Brennan had been at Wheeling Park on March 18th specifically to watch teenage boys, and when he'd seen Lucas alone shooting baskets after his friends left, he'd approached with some pretext to lure him away. The abandoned basketball suggested Brennan had convinced Lucas to walk with him toward the wooded area, perhaps claiming his car had broken down and he needed help, or offering Lucas something that made him set down the ball temporarily. Once in the secluded area near the creek, Brennan had attacked Lucas and strangled him, then transported the body in his vehicle via the maintenance road to his property 5 miles away, where he'd buried it. The service road access that investigators had identified in 1989 as a potential route had indeed been used, but without evidence or witnesses connecting Brennan to that location, the lead had gone nowhere at the time. Susan and David Grant received the full investigation results in April 2024, and they were devastated to learn that Lucas had been murdered by someone who lived so close and who'd been questioned but dismissed early in the investigation. He was right there, David said through tears. The police talked to him and let him go, and Lucas was buried on his property the whole time, and we spent 35 years searching everywhere except where our son actually was. The fact that Thomas Brennan had died in 2019 without ever being held accountable for Lucas's murder was bitter, but the family found some solace in his identity being publicly revealed and his crimes exposed. At least everyone who knew Thomas Brennan will now know he was a child killer, Susan stated. He died thinking he'd gotten away with it, but his name will forever be associated with what he did to Lucas. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Brennan had sold his property in 1995 and moved to Arizona, possibly because he feared the body would eventually be discovered, though he'd lived another 24 years without being caught. The case brought renewed attention to the importance of thoroughly investigating everyone questioned in missing persons cases, because Brennan's 1985 incident in Pittsburgh should have raised red flags that were missed or ignored, and it demonstrated that inadequate communication between jurisdictions can allow predators to slip through cracks, because West Virginia police in 1989 hadn't been aware of Brennan's suspicious behavior in Pennsylvania 4 years earlier. FBI behavioral analysts who reviewed the case determined that Brennan had likely been a serial predator who'd been watching boys for years, and they recommended investigating other unsolved cases in areas where he'd lived. This analysis led to connections being explored between Brennan and 3 other missing teenage boys from Pennsylvania and West Virginia in the 1980s. though DNA evidence couldn't be established in those cases. Lucas Grant was finally laid to rest in May 2024, 35 years after he disappeared from Wheeling Park, and over 1,000 people attended the funeral service to honor the teenager who'd never had the chance to grow up. The casket was carried by Lucas's former basketball teammates, now men in their late 40s, who'd spent decades wondering what had happened to their friend who'd stayed behind to practice free throws that March afternoon. Susan Grant, now 76, spoke at the service about the 35 years of not knowing that had been almost unbearable, and about the strange relief that came with finally being able to bury her son and know the truth. "We can finally say goodbye properly," Susan told the gathering. "For 35 years we lived in limbo, not knowing if Lucas was alive somewhere or if he was dead. And now we know, and while the truth is painful, we can finally grieve and let him rest." David Grant, now 78, placed Lucas's basketball, which had been preserved as evidence for 35 years, in the casket beside his son, returning the ball that had been abandoned on that terrible day. The red hooded sweatshirt Lucas had worn under his denim jacket was never found, likely destroyed by Thomas Brennan to eliminate evidence. But the family buried Lucas in a replica they'd purchased to give him something familiar. The resolution of Lucas's case made national headlines as an example of how construction projects can unexpectedly solve decades-old cold cases, and it prompted discussions about preserving DNA and maintaining missing persons databases. Detective Chen used Lucas's case in training seminars for law enforcement, emphasizing that every person questioned in a missing persons investigation should be thoroughly vetted with comprehensive background checks across multiple jurisdictions. If West Virginia police in 1989 had known about Thomas Brennan's 1985 incident in Pittsburgh, Chen explained, he would have been investigated much more aggressively, and we might have found Lucas decades earlier. The construction site where Lucas's remains were discovered was purchased by the Grant family, and they donated the land to the city of Wheeling to create a memorial park in their son's name. The park includes basketball courts and a playground, transforming the place where Lucas was buried into a space where children can play safely, and a bronze statue shows a teenage boy shooting a basketball. West Virginia passed legislation in 2024, requiring all law enforcement agencies to share information about suspicious behavior involving minors across state databases, reforms named Lucas Grant's Law in his memory. The law also mandates that construction companies report any human remains found during excavation within 24 hours to prevent delays in identification, creating protocols that didn't exist when Lucas was discovered. Susan and David established a foundation supporting families of long-term missing children, providing resources for DNA testing, age progression photos, and the emotional support needed to survive decades of not knowing. "We want Lucas's death to mean something," David told reporters. "If our foundation can help even one family find their missing child faster than 35 years, then Lucas's memory will have made a difference." Wheeling Park, where Lucas disappeared, installed a permanent memorial near the basketball courts with his photo and a plaque explaining what had happened and urging parents to maintain vigilance even in public spaces. The memorial reads, "Lucas Grant, 1974 and 1989, forever 14, never forgotten, lost at the place he loved," acknowledging both the tragedy and the fact that Lucas had been doing something he enjoyed when evil found him. Michael Torres, Lucas's friend who'd been the last person to see him alive at the basketball courts, attended the funeral and spoke about the guilt he'd carried for 35 years about leaving Lucas alone. "I've questioned that decision every day since," Michael said through tears, wondering if things would have been different if we'd stayed or if we'd insisted Lucas come with us. But we were kids, and we had no way of knowing what was about to happen. The case proved that DNA technology combined with construction discoveries can solve even the oldest cold cases, and that perpetrators who successfully hide bodies may die believing they escaped justice, but truth can emerge long after. It demonstrated the importance of thorough background checks and interstate communication in missing persons investigations, because Brennan's history should have made him a prime suspect if investigators had known about it. And it showed that families deserve answers no matter how much time has passed, and that advances in forensic science can provide closure that once seemed impossible. Susan and David visit Lucas's grave weekly, finally able to talk to their son at a specific place rather than wondering where in the world his remains might be, and they find peace in knowing he's home. "For 35 years we didn't know if Lucas had suffered, where he was, if we'd ever find him," Susan said at the dedication of Lucas's memorial park. "Now we know he's at rest, and while we can't get back the years we lost, we can honor his memory." The story of Lucas Grant reminds us that 14-year-olds should be safe playing basketball in public parks, that predators can hide in plain sight, and that families deserve truth no matter how long it takes to emerge. And in Wheeling, West Virginia, where a boy in a denim jacket once played basketball on a spring afternoon, his memory lives on in laws that protect children, in a park that celebrates his life, and in a community that never forgot him. The case stands as testament to determined investigation, the power of DNA technology combined with construction discoveries, and the reality that even after 35 years, the lost can be found and brought home. Lucas Grant was lost in 1989, buried 5 miles from where he disappeared, found in 2023 through excavation and DNA, and finally laid to rest in 2024 surrounded by family and friends who'd searched for him for decades. His story proves that cold cases deserve continued attention, that development projects can unexpectedly solve mysteries, and that justice, even when the perpetrator is dead, brings healing to families who've lived with unanswered questions. The basketball courts at Wheeling Park where Lucas last played are still used by teenagers today, and many who shoot baskets there don't know they're standing where a 14-year-old vanished 35 years ago. But Lucas's memorial ensures his story won't be forgotten, and parents who bring their children to the park are reminded to stay vigilant, because tragedy can strike even in places that seem safe.